The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a scholar of the law, tested him, saying, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments." This is the gospel for today. If we are to understand this particular episode in St. Matthew's Gospel, we have to try to appreciate what the Jewish way of life was. The Mosaic Law developed over a long time through the rabbis explaining how the Jewish law had to be implemented in all the circumstances of Jewish life as they lived day in and day out in different contexts. And over the centuries, these rabbis, these teachers of the law, or as we learn in today's gospel, a scholar of the law, developed that there were 613 statutes of the Mosaic Law. Perhaps we are familiar, hopefully, with the Ten Commandments, and they are part of the Mosaic Law, dictated to Moses, as we learn in the book of Exodus, chapter 24 of the book of Exodus. And we believe that they do summarize how we are to live with one another, related to God in the first 3 commandments and to one another in the second 7. But that was not the Mosaic Law in its entirety. The whole of the first 5 books of the Old Testament are really explaining the Mosaic Law, and then over the Hebrew tradition they developed into, as I said, 613 statutes. But each one of those statutes was important. There were not minor statutes and major. They all were major. And this is symbolized for us, for example, in the persecution of the Syrian dictator Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he wanted the Jews to abandon their culture, abandon the Mosaic Law, and he martyred people. He killed them if they would follow any stipulation of the Mosaic Law. And we learn in the book of Maccabees that if they did not, or if they tried to eat a piece of pork, which was forbidden by the Mosaic Law, they would be martyred, they would be killed. And we know that the mother of the 7 sons of Maccabees, She and her 7 sons were martyred because they wouldn't eat a mouthful of pork. And that is how the Jews looked upon the Mosaic Law. Every stipulation was what we would call in our terminology a mortal sin if you did not follow it. But St. Paul came along, understanding the message of Jesus in today's gospel and in his own life. And in chapter 13 of the epistle to the Romans, he said, love is the fulfillment of the law. And so when Jesus was challenged, he quoted the 6th chapter, the 4th verse of Deuteronomy. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. But then he added a passage from the 19th chapter of the book of Leviticus. You must love your neighbor as yourself. These are, according to Jesus, the 2 most important statutes of the Mosaic Law. They embody the whole of the Jews' relationship to God in the first 3 commandments and relation to one another in the second 7 commandments. So the whole law is understood by Jesus and revealed by Jesus in love. And that is why St. John, in his first epistle in the 4th chapter, says, God is love. God is love. God is not loving. God is not lovable. God is love itself. And that is why the fulfillment of the law is in love. And we find that in the life of Jesus himself, because he did not just teach that when he was preaching. He taught that by his way of living. And we know how sympathetic he was in curing those he did not even know. He loved them. And there are so many miracles of healing, forgiving in his public ministry. But the real revelation of what we are talking about in today's gospel, his answer, we must love God with all our hearts and our neighbors as ourselves, is in his death on the cross. Imagine the evil that Jesus experienced, how he was victimized by his own people and treated with such contempt and savagery by the Roman soldiers who delighted in torturing him. And yet, as he was nailed from the cross, on the cross, he said to his Father, before he gave up his spirit, Father, forgive them. They do not realize what they are doing. There is the implementation of what Jesus is talking to us about the two greatest commandments of the law. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind and with all your strength, and you must love your neighbor as yourself. And we know that when Jesus was asked in the Gospel of St. Luke, who is my neighbor? He told the story about the foreigner, the Samaritan, who took care of the victim of robbers. The Jewish companions, or the Jewish members of the same nation, they passed him by. But this foreigner, who knew that this man suffering and dying was a human being, took care of him, because he looked upon him as his neighbor. And so when we're examining ourselves to know whether we are keeping the two greatest commandments that we inherited from the Jewish tradition, we should ask ourselves, how do we follow them? And we take Jesus as our example of how we must keep these two greatest commandments that will give us freedom, liberate us, and keep us close to Jesus himself by imitating him who is the way, the truth, and the life.